The wind didn't just blow through Cleveland on December 18, 1982. It screamed. They called it the White Death, a blizzard so ferocious it buried cars, snapped power lines, and turned the entire city into a frozen wasteland where visibility was measured in inches and survival was measured in layers of wool. The temperature had plummeted to 10 degrees below zero, a cold so absolute it felt like it could freeze the breath in your lungs before you even exhaled. But on the porch of a modest Victorian house on 42nd Street, the snow wasn't white. It was a shocking, violent crimson. Serafina March, 30 years old and the neighborhood's beloved piano teacher, lay sprawled across her own welcome mat. She wasn't wearing a coat. She wasn't wearing boots. She was dressed in a simple house sweater and jeans, her arms thrown out as if she had opened the door to welcome a friend, only to be met with the end of her life. There were no footprints leading to her. There were no footprints leading away. The blizzard, in its cruel efficiency, had scrubbed the world clean within minutes of the gunshot, leaving only the body and the silence. Most people believe that when a case goes cold for 40 years, it stays cold. We tell ourselves that justice has an expiration date, that after 4 decades, the secrets are buried too deep to ever be excavated. We think the dead stop talking, but this story proves that the dead don't just talk. Sometimes they scream from the evidence locker. Because while the killer thought the snow had hidden his tracks, he left something behind, something so small, so seemingly insignificant, that for 42 years nobody realized it was the key to a political dynasty's destruction. This is the story of a murder that shouldn't have happened, a suspect that shouldn't exist, and a piece of evidence that survived the deep freeze of history. And if you believe that no amount of time should protect a monster from the truth, you need to press that subscribe button right now. Do it for Serafina, because while you sit there in the warmth watching this, her family spent 42 Christmases wondering why a woman who dedicated her life to music was silenced by a gunshot in the snow. The discovery was made by a neighbor, brave enough to check on the block's angel when the power lines started snapping. He found Serafina face up, her eyes open and staring at the gray, swirling sky. The medical examiner would later determine she had been shot once in the chest at close range with a .38 caliber round. The heat of the bullet had cauterized the wound instantly, but the blood had still pooled, freezing solid against the wood of the porch. It was a scene of stark, high-contrast horror, but it was what lay next to her hand that confused the initial investigators. Frozen into the ice, just inches from her fingertips, was a half-eaten peppermint candy. It wasn't hers. Serafina was diabetic. Her kitchen was full of sugar-free, hard candies, but nothing like this cheap, red and white striped confection. It looked like something a child would buy for a nickel. The police in 1982 bagged it, tagged it and put it in a freezer, assuming it was debris blown onto the porch by the storm. They focused their attention on the usual suspects: the jealous ex-husband who had moved to Cincinnati, the local drifter known for aggressive panhandling, the creepy landlord. Months turned into years. The ex-husband had an ironclad alibi. The drifter had frozen to death in a rail car the same night Serafina died. The landlord passed a polygraph. The case of the piano teacher murdered in the blizzard became a local legend, a ghost story told to warn children not to open the door to strangers. The evidence box marked the March. Serafina, 82. Bree was shoved to the back of the archives, gathering dust while the world moved on. The city of Cleveland healed, the snow melted, and the blood washed away. But science was marching forward, faster than any killer could run. Cut to 2024, Detective Lucas. Bell was the kind of cop who hated loose ends. He was young, driven, and specialized in cold case. Genetic genealogy, the same technology that caught the Golden State Killer. He wasn't looking for fingerprints. He was looking for ghosts in the genome. When he pulled the Serafina March file, he wasn't interested in the witness statements or the grainy, black and white crime scene photos. He was interested in the candy. The peppermint had been preserved. In the evidence, deep freeze for 42 years. It was a long shot, a Hail Mary, pass thrown 4 decades late. But Bell knew that when you eat a piece of hard candy, you leave more than just sugar behind. You leave epithelial cells from your cheeks. You leave saliva. You leave your entire genetic identity. Bell sent the sample to a private lab in Virginia, bypassing the state backlog. He wasn't expecting a direct hit in the criminal database. He was looking for a family tree. He was looking for a second cousin, a great aunt, anyone who could point him toward the person who stood on that porch in 1982. The waiting is the hardest part of the job. It creates a heavy, suffocating tension, knowing that a computer server thousands of miles away is crunching data that could rewrite history. While Bell waited, the city of Cleveland was preparing for a different kind of celebration. State Senator Daniel O'Connell was announcing his re-election campaign. O'Connell was a local hero, a tough on crime politician who had cleaned up the unions and revitalized the waterfront. He was a family man, a pillar of the community, the kind of guy who kissed babies and shook hands with a grip that felt like iron. 2 weeks later, the email hit Detective Bell's inbox. It wasn't a partial match. It wasn't a distant relative. The lab had found a direct hit. The DNA on the 42-year-old peppermint candy matched a profile already in the system, not from a criminal database, but from a voluntary sample given for a genealogy project to trace Irish heritage in Cleveland's leadership. Bell stared at the screen. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. The room seemed to lose its oxygen. The name on the screen didn't make sense. It was impossible. It defied the logic of every profile, every psychological evaluation, every theory the police had held since 1982. The DNA belonged to Senator Daniel O'Connell. Bell sat back in his chair, the hum of the precinct fading into a dull roar in his ears. He did the math on a notepad, his pen scratching frantically. Current year, 2024. Crime year, 1982. Difference, 42 years. Senator O'Connell was 54 years old today. Bell subtracted 42 from 54. He stared at the number 12. If Daniel O'Connell was the one who spit that candy onto the porch, if he was the one standing there when the gun went off, if he was the killer, he was 12 years old, a 7th grader, a child. Bell pulled up the senator's biography. In 1982, Daniel O'Connell lived 3 streets over from Serafina March. He wasn't a gang member. He wasn't a delinquent. He was the neighborhood paperboy. The implications were terrifying. Bell wasn't just looking at a murder suspect. He was looking at a child killer who had grown up to write the laws of the state. A man who had shaken thousands of hands, signed legislation, and looked into the cameras for decades, all while carrying the secret of a woman bleeding out in the snow. Bell grabbed his coat and his badge. He didn't call the DA. He didn't call the press. He grabbed his partner and headed for the squad car. The sirens remained off. This wasn't a chase. It was a reckoning. As they drove toward the senator's gated mansion, the snow began to fall over Cleveland again, light and dusting the streets, a ghostly echo of that night in 1982. Bell knew that once he knocked on that door, once the cuffs came out, the city would erupt. They would call him a liar. They would call it a political hit job. They would say it was impossible. But the DNA didn't lie. The peppermint didn't lie. And as Bell pulled up to the iron gates of the O'Connell estate, he realized that the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones hiding in the shadows. They are the ones smiling at us from the podium, the ones we vote for, the ones we trust. The paperboy had come home, and 42 years late, the bill was finally due. The O'Connell estate sat on a hill overlooking the Cuyahoga River, a sprawling brick fortress that screamed old money and unimpeachable character. Inside, the air smelled of expensive leather, polished mahogany, and the kind of quiet stability that only generational wealth can buy. It was the type of house where scandals went to die, suffocated by heavy velvet drapes and non-disclosure agreements. Senator Daniel O'Connell was sitting in his study, reviewing a speech for the Fraternal Order of Police regarding new funding for cold case units. The irony, thick and suffocating, hung in the room like cigar smoke, though the senator didn't smoke. He was a man of discipline, a man of rules. Outside, the silence of the upscale neighborhood was shattered, not by sirens, but by the crunch of tires on gravel. Detective Lucas Bell hadn't come alone. He had brought a convoy. 4 cruisers, 2 unmarked SUVs, and a warrant signed by a judge whose hand had shaken as he put pen to paper. They didn't use the sirens because they didn't want him to run, but also because deep down they were terrified of being wrong. Arresting a state senator isn't just police work, it's career suicide if the DNA lab made a decimal point error. Bell stepped out of his vehicle into the crisp night air. The snow was falling harder now, blurring the edges of the world. He walked up the stone steps, his boots heavy with the weight of what he was about to do. He didn't ring the doorbell. He pounded on the solid oak door with the flat of his hand. 3 hard, authoritative strikes that echoed the 3 gunshots of a different life, though Serafina had only taken 1 bullet. When the door opened, it wasn't a butler or a maid who answered. It was Daniel O'Connell himself. He was wearing a cashmere cardigan and reading glasses, holding a tumbler of scotch. He looked every inch the statesman. Silver hair, perfectly coiffed, jawline still strong, eyes intelligent and weary. He looked at Bell, then he looked past Bell, at the wall of blue uniforms standing in the snow. He didn't ask, "What is this?" He didn't shout, "Do you know who I am?" He just took a sip of his scotch, his hand trembling so slightly that only a trained observer would notice the ripples in the amber liquid. "Senator Daniel O'Connell," Bell said, his voice carrying across the silent lawn, "you are under arrest for the murder of Serafina March." The cuffs clicked. It was a metallic final sound that seemed to sever the timeline of Daniel's life. The before was a life of prestige, power, and public adoration. The after was this, a middle-aged man being guided by the elbow into the back of a squad car, while his neighbors peeked through their blinds, phones raised, recording the fall of Rome in real time. By morning, the city of Cleveland was in a state of collective shock that bordered on hysteria. The news cycle didn't just break, it shattered. "Senator arrested," flashed in bold red banners across every local channel. The footage of O'Connell being led away in handcuffs played on an infinite loop in diners, offices, and living rooms. The community's reaction was visceral and violent. This wasn't some shady backroom politician known for graft. This was Danny. This was the man who sponsored the Little League teams, the man who personally handed out turkeys at the shelter every Thanksgiving, the man who had built his entire platform on protecting the innocent. "It's a witch hunt," screamed a supporter into a news microphone outside the precinct. "They're trying to ruin him before the election. He's a saint." The phone lines at the station were jammed with death threats against Detective Bell. The narrative was already being spun. The corrupt police department was framing a good man. But Bell wasn't watching the news. He was sitting in Interrogation Room B, watching a man who had spent 42 years waiting for this exact moment. Before we step into that room, ask yourself this: how well do you really know the people you admire? We build pedestals for our heroes because it makes us feel safe, but sometimes the higher the pedestal, the longer the shadow it casts. If you believe that the truth is worth finding, even when it hurts, even when it destroys the heroes we love, please engage with this story. Your likes and comments help us push these narratives past the algorithm's gatekeepers, ensuring that victims like Serafina aren't forgotten just because their killer wore a suit. Inside the interrogation room, the atmosphere was heavy, pressurized. The air conditioning hummed a monotonous drone. Senator O'Connell sat at the metal table. They had taken his cashmere cardigan, his belt, and his shoelaces. He sat in a white dress shirt, the top button undone, looking smaller than he ever had on television. Bell walked in and threw a file folder onto the table. It slid across the metal surface and stopped inches from O'Connell's hands. "You have the right to an attorney," Bell started, reciting the litany he'd said 1,000 times. "I know the law, Detective," O'Connell interrupted. His voice was calm, resonant, the voice that had charmed voters for 2 decades. "I wrote half the statutes you operate under." "Then you know what DNA is," Bell said, pulling out a chair and sitting opposite him. "And you know that it doesn't care about your approval ratings. It doesn't care about your legacy." Bell reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph of the evidence bag containing the 42-year-old peppermint candy. He placed it on the table. "We found this next to her body, Daniel, frozen in the ice. It has your saliva on it. It has your genetic code woven into the sugar." O'Connell looked at the picture. He didn't recoil. He looked at it with a strange, heartbreaking tenderness. "And I did the math," Bell continued, leaning forward, invading the senator's personal space. "I looked at your birth certificate. You were born in 1970. Serafina was killed in 1982. Bell paused, letting the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. "You were 12 years old," Bell whispered. "You weren't a hitman. You weren't a jealous lover. You were a 7th grader. You were the Paperboy." For the first time, the senator's composure cracked. A spasm of pain crossed his face, tightening the muscles around his eyes. He wasn't looking at Bell anymore. He was looking through the walls, back to a snowy porch in 1982. "A Paperboy," O'Connell repeated softly. "Yes, that's what I was. I delivered the plain dealer every morning at 5 a.m., even in the snow, especially in the snow." Bell studied him. In criminal psychology, this is the moment the suspect usually pivots. They deny, they deflect, or they lawyer up. They fight for their survival. But O'Connell wasn't fighting. His body language was all wrong. His shoulders were slumped, his hands flat on the table, palms down, a sign of submission, of grounding. He wasn't a predator caught in a trap. He was a man who had finally put down a heavy load he'd been carrying for a lifetime. "Why, Daniel?" Bell asked. "Why did a 12-year-old boy walk up to the kindest woman in the neighborhood and put a bullet in her chest?" O'Connell didn't answer immediately. He reached out and touched the photo of the candy wrapper, tracing the jagged edge of the plastic with his index finger. "She was beautiful," O'Connell said, his voice distant. "Not just pretty. She had a light inside her. When she played the piano, you could hear it from the street. I used to stop my bike just to listen." "Did she hurt you?" Bell asked, probing for a motive. "Did she touch you?" O'Connell laughed, a dry, mirthless sound. "Hurt me? No. She was the only one who didn't." Bell pulled another photo from the file. It was the crime scene photo. Serafina March, lying in the red snow, her eyes fixed on the grey sky. It was a brutal, graphic image, usually used to shock suspects into a reaction. He slid it over the picture of the candy. "Look at her, Daniel. Look at what you did." The senator looked, and then the facade of the pillar of the community crumbled completely. His eyes filled with tears, hot, fast tears that spilled over his cheeks and dripped onto the metal table. He didn't look away from the body. He stared at it like it was a holy relic. He took a shuddering breath, his chest heaving with the effort to keep from sobbing aloud. He looked up at Bell, his eyes red-rimmed and swimming with a grief that felt ancient. "You think you caught me," the senator whispered, his voice trembling. "You think this is a victory." "I think I caught a killer," Bell said. O'Connell shook his head slowly. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, as if he were confessing a secret love affair rather than a homicide. "I haven't been running from you, Detective," he said, the tears tracking through the stubble on his chin. "I haven't been hiding." He looked back down at the photo of the dead woman, his expression softening into something that looked terrifyingly like love. "I've been waiting for you," O'Connell whispered. "For 40 years. I've just been waiting for someone to stop me." The memory didn't come back to Daniel O'Connell in words. It came back in temperature. Sitting in the sterile, fluorescent-lit interrogation room, The 54-year-old senator shivered, though the precinct was kept at a steady 72 degrees. In his mind, it was 5 in the morning. The sky was the color of bruised iron, and the wind was cutting through his thin windbreaker like a serrated knife. He was back on his Schwinn bicycle, the tires wobbling on the black ice of 42nd Street, the canvas bag of newspapers dragging him down like an anchor. "My father," O'Connell began, his voice rasping as if he hadn't used it in years, "believed that pain built character. He believed that if you weren't suffering, you weren't learning. To understand why a 12-year-old boy might kill, you have to understand the world that shaped him. In 1982, Cleveland was a city of rust and muscle, a place where the fires of the steel mills were dying out and a cold, hard cynicism was settling in their place. And the king of this decaying kingdom was James Big Jim O'Connell. Big Jim was a union boss who ran the local pipefitters with a terrifying mixture of charisma and brutality. He was a man who could charm a mayor at noon and break a strikebreaker's jaw by dinner. At home, he was a tyrant who ruled by the mood of the hour. If the Browns lost, the house went silent. If the whiskey ran low, people got hurt. And Daniel, small for his age, bookish and sensitive, was the primary target of his father's disdain. "He made me get the paper route," O'Connell told Bell, staring at his hands. "He said I was too soft, said I needed to learn the value of $1 and the bite of the cold. Every morning, rain or snow, I was out there. If I missed a porch, if a paper got wet, he wouldn't hit me. No, that would have been too easy. He would make me stand outside in the snow without a coat until my lips turned blue. He called it exposure therapy." Bell listened, his pen hovering over his notepad. He was building a profile of a pressure cooker, a boy living in a war zone, desperate for an escape, pushed to the brink of psychological fracture. "And Serafina?" Bell asked. A ghost of a smile touched the senator's lips. It was the first genuine expression Bell had seen on him since the arrest. "She was the only warm place in the world," O'Connell whispered. "Serafina March wasn't just a customer on Danny's route. She was his sanctuary." The first time she invited him in, it was late November. He had wiped out on the ice in front of her walkway, skinning his knees and scattering the Sunday edition across the slush. He was terrified, freezing and crying, not because of the pain, but because he knew Big Jim would make him pay for the ruined papers. The door opened and she was there. She didn't yell, she didn't look at the mess, she looked at him. "She brought me inside," O'Connell recalled, his eyes losing focus. "Her house smelled like cinnamon tea and old wood. She cleaned my knees, she gave me hot chocolate. And then she played." Serafina had a baby grand piano in her front room. To Danny, whose house was filled with the sounds of shouting and breaking glass, the music she made sounded like magic. It was complex, melancholic and beautiful. She saw him watching her hands, entranced, and she made him an offer that changed his life. "Come by after your route," she had said. "I'll teach you. Just don't tell your father." For 3 weeks, leading up to the murder, that was their ritual. Danny would finish his route in record time, sprinting through the snow just to steal 20 minutes on her piano bench. He wasn't a prodigy, but he was eager. He learned to read the notes. He learned to let his guard down. For 20 minutes a day, he wasn't Big Jim's disappointment. He was just a boy making music. "She saved me," O'Connell said, a tear finally escaping and tracking through the stubble on his cheek. "My father, he broke my arm the year before because I dropped a wrench. But Serafina, she never raised her voice. She touched my shoulder once, just to correct my posture, and I flinched. I thought she was going to hit me. She just held her hand there until I stopped shaking." Bell leaned forward. The motive didn't fit. This wasn't the story of a boy who hated his teacher. This was a love story, a platonic, desperate love between a neglected child and the one person who showed him kindness. "If you loved her, Daniel," Bell asked, his voice soft but demanding, "why is she dead?" The senator closed his eyes. The memory was physical now, a crushing weight in his chest. "Because love isn't enough to save you when you're living in hell, detective. Sometimes love is the thing that gets you killed." While Bell was peeling back the layers of the past in the interrogation room, a tactical team was dismantling the present at the O'Connell estate. The search warrant was comprehensive. They were looking for diaries, photos, anything that linked the senator to the victim. But Bell had given them a specific instruction based on a hunch, a theory about the psychology of guilt. Killers who mourn their victims don't throw away the weapon, Bell had told the lead CSI. They keep it. It becomes a totem. Look for a shrine. The team was in the senator's private study, a room lined with books on law and history. They checked the safe. It contained only legal documents and some heirloom jewelry. They checked the floorboards. Nothing. Then a young officer noticed something about the built-in bookshelves. The molding on the bottom right corner didn't sit quite flush with the floor. There was a hairline gap, barely visible unless you were on your hands and knees. He used a pry bar. The wood groaned, then popped loose. Behind the false panel was a small, dust-free cavity. Inside, wrapped in a piece of purple velvet that looked decades old, was a heavy object. The officer unwrapped it carefully. It was a snub-nosed .38 revolver. The metal was pitted with age, but the mechanism was oiled. It hadn't been fired in a long time, but it had been cared for. It had been held. "Bag it," the officer said, his voice tight. "We got the gun." Back at the station, Bell's phone buzzed. He checked the text message. It was a photo from the scene. The gun, the caliber matched the bullet that killed Serafina. The ballistics test would be a formality. Bell knew in his gut this was the weapon. He slid the phone across the table, showing the image to the senator. "We found it, Daniel, behind the bookshelf." O'Connell looked at the gun, the instrument of his destruction, and let out a long, shuddering breath that sounded like a soul leaving a body. He didn't deny it. He didn't claim it was planted. "I couldn't throw it in the river," O'Connell whispered. "I couldn't let it rust away in the snow. It was the only thing I had left of that day." "Where did you get the gun, Daniel?" Bell asked. "A 12-year-old boy doesn't just walk into a store and buy a .38 snub-nose." The senator looked up, his eyes hard and clear for the first time. The sadness evaporated, replaced by a cold, terrifying resolve. This was the twist Bell hadn't seen coming, the jagged edge of the puzzle piece that refused to fit. "It was my father's," O'Connell said. "He kept it in the glove box of his truck. He told me it was for protection. He told me a man always needs to be ready to do what's necessary." "Did you steal it?" "No," O'Connell said. "He gave it to me." Bell froze. "He gave it to you? Why?" "He told me I had a job to do," the senator said, his voice dropping to a whisper that chilled the room more than the memory of the blizzard. "He told me that Serafina was a problem, that she was asking questions she shouldn't be asking, that she was going to destroy our family." Bell felt the ground shift. The police report Serafina had filed, the suspicious activity. It wasn't just about bruises. She had seen something else. She knew something about Big Jim O'Connell. "So you killed her to protect your father?" Bell asked, trying to fit the narrative together. O'Connell laughed, a broken weeping sound. "Protect him, detective. I hated him. I wanted him dead every day of my life." "Then why, Daniel? Why pull the trigger?" The senator looked at the one-way mirror, staring at his own reflection, at the face of the boy trapped inside the man. "I didn't kill her because I wanted to," he whispered. "I killed her because she was leaving. She told me she was going to California. She packed a suitcase. She was going to leave me there alone with him, and I knew if she left I wouldn't survive the winter." Bell stared at him. It was a motive born of pure, childish terror, abandonment. "She was going to save herself," O'Connell said, tears streaming down his face. "So I stopped her." The confession was signed an hour later. The gun was a match. The case was closed. Or so it seemed. But as Bell walked back to his desk, looking at the crime scene photos one last time, something caught his eye. He picked up a magnifying glass and looked at the angle of the bullet wound in the coroner's diagram. The bullet had entered Serafina's chest at a downward angle, 30 degrees downward. Bell frowned. He looked at the mugshot of Daniel O'Connell at age 12. He was 4 feet 10 inches tall. Serafina March was 5'6". If Danny was standing on the porch and she was standing in the doorway, he would have been looking up at her. The bullet should have traveled upward. For the bullet to travel downward, the shooter had to be taller than her, significantly taller, or standing on something. Belle looked at the photo of the porch. It was flat. No stairs, no elevation. Danny was too short to make that shot. Belle felt a cold prickle on the back of his neck. The senator had confessed. The DNA was there. The gun was there. But the physics were wrong. Daniel O'Connell was lying, not about being there, not about the gun. But he hadn't pulled the trigger. Belle grabbed his coat. He wasn't done. He needed to go back to the O'Connell house, not to find evidence, but to look at the architecture of a lie that had lasted 42 years. Someone else was on that porch. Someone tall. Someone who hated Serafina March enough to kill her, and someone Daniel O'Connell loved, or feared, enough to protect for a lifetime. The cold case wasn't solved. It was just beginning to thaw. The physics of murder are stubborn. They don't bend for confessions, and they don't care about tears. Detective Lucas Bell stood on the front porch of the house on 42nd Street. It had been sold 3 times since 1982, currently occupied by a young couple who had no idea that their welcome mat sat on the exact spot where a woman had bled to death 42 years prior. Bell had taped off the area, ignoring the confused glances of the neighbors. He held a laser measure in one hand and a crime scene dowel in the other. He set the dowel at the height of Serafina March's chest wound, 4 feet, 8 inches from the ground. He backed up 3 feet, the estimated distance of the shooter based on the stippling, or powder burns, found on her sweater. Then he adjusted the angle. The coroner's report was unequivocal. The bullet traveled downward at a 30-degree angle, piercing the left lung and lodging in the spine. Bell crouched down until his eyes were at the level of a 12-year-old boy, 4 feet, 10 inches. He aimed the laser at the imaginary wound. The red dot hit the doorframe, 6 inches below where the wound would be. For Daniel O'Connell to have shot Serafina March at a downward angle, he would have needed to be hovering 2 feet in the air, or he would have needed to be standing on a crate. But the crime scene photos showed a porch swept clean by the wind. No crates, no chairs, just a flat, frozen surface. He didn't do it, Bell whispered to the empty street. He was there. The candy proves it. The gun proves it. But he didn't pull the trigger. If Daniel O'Connell was confessing to a crime he physically couldn't have committed, the investigation had just shifted from a "who done it" to a "why is he lying?" And to answer that, Bell needed to understand not just the boy, but the war zone he lived in. He drove back to the Hall of Justice, bypassing the interrogation room where the senator was currently sitting in a silence that felt like penance. Bell went to the basement archives. The digitalization of the Cleveland PD records was an ongoing, underfunded project, meaning the files from 1982 were still rotting in cardboard boxes that smelled of mildew and forgotten sins. Bell pulled the box marked O'Connell, Domestic Calls, 1980-1985. It was heavy. Big Jim O'Connell hadn't just been a union boss. He was a frequent flyer with the precinct. But as Bell flipped through the incident reports, he saw a pattern. Noise complaint, disturbance, fight. In every single instance, the responding officers had left without making an arrest. Parties separated. Verbal warning. The blue wall of silence protected powerful men, even back then. But at the bottom of the stack, misfiled under M instead of O, Bell found a carbon copy report that stopped his heart. It was dated December 10th, 1982, 8 days before the murder. Complainant Serafina March. Nature of incident: suspicion of child endangerment. Bell held the yellowed paper under the desk lamp. The handwriting was elegant, looped script, a piano teacher's hand. I'm reporting bruises on the arms and neck of Daniel O'Connell, age 12. The child claims he fell, but the markings are consistent with a grip pattern. I believe his father is escalating. I intend to contact Child Protective Services on Monday morning if the police do not intervene. Bell sat back. the narrative in his head rearranging itself with a violent click. The senator had lied. He hadn't killed Serafina because she was leaving. That was a child's interpretation of the events, or perhaps a lie constructed to protect the truth. The truth was much darker. Serafina March wasn't just a piano teacher. She was a whistleblower. She had looked at the most powerful, violent man in the neighborhood and threatened to expose him. She had signed her own death warrant the moment she filed this report. Bell grabbed the file and marched back upstairs. The theory was solidifying in his mind. Big Jim O'Connell found out about the report. He couldn't kill her himself, too risky for a man with political connections. So he used the ultimate weapon. He used his son. He sent Danny to the porch with a gun, forcing the boy to kill the only person who was trying to save him. It was a mob tactic. Blood in, blood out. Make the boy complicit so he can never testify against the father. Bell slammed the door to the interrogation room open. The noise made the senator jump, a crack in his stoic armor. "You lied to me, Daniel," Bell said, throwing the police report onto the table. O'Connell looked at the document. He didn't read it. He seemed to recognize the shape of it. "She wasn't just leaving you," Bell said, his voice rising. "She was trying to save you. She filed a report against your father a week before she died. She was going to call CPS. She was going to take you away from him." A profound stillness settled over the senator. He closed his eyes, and a single tear leaked out. She reported him. She tried. And I think your father found out. I think Big Jim O'Connell put that gun in your hand and marched you over there. I think he told you that if you didn't kill her, he'd kill you. Is that it, Daniel? Did he make you pull the trigger to save yourself? It was a perfect theory. It explained the gun. It explained the trauma. It explained why a man would hate his father but still cover for him out of fear. But the senator started to laugh. It was a dry, rattling sound, devoid of humor. He opened his eyes, and they were hard as flint. "You think my father did this?" O'Connell asked, pointing to the photo of the dead woman. "You think Big Jim O'Connell cared enough about a piano teacher to orchestrate a hit? Detective, you give him too much credit. My father was a drunk and a bully, but he wasn't a mastermind." "Then explain the ballistics," Bell shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "I just came from the porch. The bullet entered her chest at a 30-degree downward angle. You were 4'10". She was 5'6". Unless you were levitating, Daniel, you couldn't have made that shot." The room went silent. The hum of the ventilation system seemed to scream. O'Connell froze. The logic of the physics had pierced the veil of his confession. He looked at his hands, then at the photo of Serafina, then at Bell. For the first time, the look of resignation was replaced by panic. "I shot her," O'Connell insisted, his voice rising, desperate. "I held the gun, I pulled the trigger, I did it." "No," Bell said, lowering his voice to a lethal calm. "You were there, I believe that. You held the candy. You probably even held the gun afterward. But you didn't shoot her. You were too short." Bell leaned in, his face inches from the senator's. "Who was standing behind you, Daniel? Who was tall enough to reach over a 12-year-old boy's shoulder and execute a woman in cold blood?" The senator's breathing became ragged. He was hyperventilating. The facade of the statesman was gone, replaced by the terrified child in the snow. "It doesn't matter," O'Connell gasped. "I'm the one who confessed. I'm the one who's here. Take the win, detective. Close the case." "I don't want to win. I want the truth. You are protecting someone. It wasn't your father. You hate him too much to take the fall for him 40 years later. You wouldn't destroy your life for Big Jim." Bell walked around the table, circling the suspect like a shark. "Who do you love that much, Daniel? Who do you fear that much?" O'Connell clamped his mouth shut. He squeezed his eyes tight, shaking his head back and forth, a silent mantra of no, no, no. Bell stopped at the door. He looked back at the broken man. "I'm going to find out," Bell said. "I'm going back to the house. I'm going to look at every inch of that room where the gun was hidden, and I'm going to find the ghost you're trying to hide." Bell left the room, leaving the senator alone with his ghosts. He walked to his desk and pulled up the O'Connell family tree again. He looked at the mugshot of Big Jim O'Connell, 6'2", imposing, violent. He fit the ballistics. He fit the profile. But then Belle's eyes drifted to the other person in the family file, the person nobody talked about, the person who wasn't in the police reports because the police never came for her. He pulled up a grainy newspaper photo from 1982, taken at Big Jim's funeral, 5 years after the murder. It showed a teenage Daniel standing next to his mother, Martha O'Connell. She was tall, statuesque. She stood with a rigid, terrifying posture, her hand resting on Daniel's shoulder, not in comfort, but in possession. Her grip looked tight, too tight. Belle remembered the note in the police report. Suspicion of child endangerment. Serafina hadn't specified which parent was hurting the boy. Everyone had just assumed it was the father because he was the loud one, because he was the public monster. But sometimes the most dangerous things in a house aren't the ones that scream, they are the ones that whisper. Belle grabbed his keys. He needed to go back to the beginning. He needed to understand the mother, because if Daniel O'Connell was willing to go to prison for life to protect a memory, it wasn't the memory of a man he hated. It was the memory of the woman who birthed him. The detective walked out into the snow, the pieces of the puzzle finally starting to form a picture, and it was uglier than anything he had imagined. The shooter wasn't a hitman. The shooter wasn't a boy. The shooter was the hand that rocked the cradle. The archives of the Cleveland Police Department were located in the sub-basement, a windowless labyrinth of metal shelves that smelled of damp concrete and decaying paper. It was a graveyard of bad intentions, where the sins of the city were catalogued in cardboard boxes and forgotten. Detective Lucas Bell sat at a rusted metal table, the hum of a dehumidifier the only sound in the room. In front of him was box number 492B, labeled March, Serafina, Personal Effects. Bell had the how, the gun, the angle, the boy on the porch. He had the who, Daniel O'Connell, confessing to a crime he physically couldn't have committed, but he was missing the why. The senator's story about killing Serafina because she was leaving felt incomplete, a jagged shard of a memory that didn't fit the rest of the mosaic. He opened the box. It contained the mundane artifacts of a life interrupted, a keychain with a miniature piano, a wallet with $3, and a library card, a tube of lipstick. But at the bottom of the box, crushed beneath a heavy winter scarf, was a large manila envelope marked Contents of Suitcase, found in hallway. Bell frowned. The original police report had mentioned a suitcase near the front door. The 1982 detectives had assumed Serafina was fleeing a lover or perhaps planning a holiday trip. They hadn't looked closer because they were too busy looking for a drifter. Bell opened the envelope and slid the contents onto the table. First came the clothes list. 3 wool sweaters, 2 pairs of jeans, a nightgown, normal. Then came the toiletries, also normal. But then Bell pulled out a smaller plastic baggie containing items that didn't belong to a 30-year-old woman. A stack of Marvel comic books, the X-Men, dog-eared and well-read, a bag of plastic Green Army men, a thick, hand-knitted blue sweater clearly sized for a child, and tucked into the pages of one of the comic books, an envelope from TWA Airlines. Bell opened the airline envelope. His hands, usually steady, felt a tremor of anticipation. Inside were 2 tickets, one-way Cleveland to Los Angeles. Passenger 1, Serafina March. Passenger 2, child, unaccompanied minor status, waived guardian present. The date of the flight was December 19th, 1982, the morning after the murder. Bell sat back, the breath leaving his lungs in a rush. The narrative in his head realigned with a sickening click. Serafina March wasn't calling Child Protective Services to have Daniel taken away. She wasn't leaving him behind to save herself from the winter. She was kidnapping him. She had packed a bag not for a vacation, but for a rescue mission. She had seen the bruises on the boy, felt the terror radiating off him, and decided that the law wasn't moving fast enough. She was going to take him to California, away from the snow, away from the father who beat him, and away from the house on the hill. Belle looked at the tickets. They were printed on carbon paper, the red ink faded but legible. They were proof of a heroism that had gone unrecognized for 42 years. Serafina March died not as a victim, but as a savior who ran out of time. And Daniel. Belle grabbed the evidence and ran for the stairs. He took them two at a time, his mind racing. Daniel O'Connell had spent his entire life believing he killed the only person who loved him because she was abandoning him. He had built a fortress of guilt around a misunderstanding. Back in the interrogation room, the senator was sitting exactly where Belle had left him. He looked hollowed out, a man who had poured all his secrets onto the table and was now just waiting for the cage to close. Belle walked in, not with aggression, but with a heavy, somber purpose. He didn't throw the file this time. He placed the two airline tickets gently on the metal table, sliding them into O'Connell's line of sight. "You got it wrong, Daniel," Belle said softly. O'Connell looked at the tickets. He squinted, his eyes adjusting to the small print. He read the names. He read the date. "What is this?" O'Connell asked, his voice brittle. "She wasn't leaving you," Belle said. "She was taking you with her." The senator stared at the paper. He picked up the ticket marked "Child." His thumb brushed the date. "She packed a bag," Belle continued, his voice thick with emotion. "We found it by the door. It had your comic books in it. It had a sweater she made for you. She bought 2 tickets to Los Angeles for the morning of December 19th. She wasn't calling the police on your father to get you put in a foster home, Daniel. She was breaking the law to save your life." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a worldview shattering. For 42 years, Daniel O'Connell had told himself a story. "I am a monster who killed the woman who tried to leave me." It was a tragic, selfish narrative, but it was one he could understand. It made him the villain. But this made him the destroyer of his own salvation. "No," O'Connell whispered. "No, she said she had to go. She said she couldn't stay here anymore. She couldn't stay here because she was terrified for you," Belle pressed. "She was going to take you to the sunshine. She was going to raise you. She loved you, Daniel. She loved you enough to give up everything." O'Connell made a sound that wasn't quite human, a low, keen moan of agony that rose from the bottom of his chest. He doubled over, clutching the tickets to his heart, rocking back and forth in the metal chair. The statesman, the senator, the man of the people. He was gone. In his place was a 12-year-old boy realizing that he had misunderstood the most important moment of his life. "I didn't know," O'Connell sobbed, the tears falling freely now, soaking the ancient paper. "I thought she was leaving me with them. I thought I was going to be alone." Belle waited. He let the grief wash over the room. This was the cruelty of the case. The motive wasn't malice. It was a tragic error in translation between a desperate woman and a traumatized child. "But you still didn't shoot her," Belle said, steering the ship back into the storm. "We established that. The angle is wrong. You were too short. You didn't pull the trigger." O'Connell stopped rocking. He wiped his face with his sleeve, but he didn't look up. "It doesn't matter," he rasped. "I was there. I'm responsible. I stopped her. If I hadn't gone over there, if I hadn't brought the gun—" "Who were you protecting, Daniel?" Belle demanded. "Your father? Big Jim?" O'Connell shook his head violently. "No, not him. Never him." "Then who? Who was tall enough to make that shot? Who hated Serafina enough to kill her?" The senator went still. He placed the tickets flat on the table, smoothing them out with a reverence usually reserved for scripture. He took a deep breath, composing himself, pulling the shattered pieces of his mask back together. "I want to confess," O'Connell said, his voice dead and flat. "I want to sign the paper. I want to go to my cell. I waive my rights. I did it. I killed her. Put it in the books, detective. Be the hero who took down the senator." He was shutting down. He was trying to fall on the sword to end the conversation. Belle slammed his hand on the table. "I can't accept a false confession, Daniel. The ballistics don't match." If I take this to court, a defense attorney will tear it apart in 5 minutes. They'll walk you out the door and the real killer stays free. Is that what you want? Serafina died saving you. Do you want her killer to die in a warm bed? O'Connell looked up. His eyes were terrified, not for himself, but for the ghost he was hiding. The killer is already gone, O'Connell whispered. Let it go, Belle. You have your man, you have your DNA, you have the gun. Just let it end. The killer isn't gone, Belle countered, his mind working furiously. He thought about the O'Connell family. The father was dead, heart attack in 87. But who else was there? Who else would a 12-year-old boy protect with his life? Who else had a grip on him tight enough to last 4 decades? Belle grabbed the file and pulled out the photo from Big Jim's funeral. The woman standing next to Daniel, the mother, Martha O'Connell. He slapped the photo on the table next to the tickets. She's still alive, isn't she? Belle asked. Your mother. She's in that nursing home on the west side, the one you donate half your salary to. O'Connell flinched as if he'd been struck. Don't, he warned, his voice dropping an octave. Leave her out of this. She was tall, Belle said, studying the photo. 5'8" in heels, taller than Serafina. If she stood on the porch, if she stood behind you... Stop it! O'Connell shouted, standing up, the chair screeching against the floor. I told you I did it! I told you! Why would you protect Big Jim? Belle continued, ignoring the outburst. You wouldn't. You hated him. But a boy loves his mother, even a mother who hurts him, especially a mother who hurts him. Belle saw the panic in the senator's eyes. It was the panic of a child who'd been told to keep a secret that was the foundation of his entire existence. She was there, wasn't she? Belle pushed. She didn't trust Big Jim to handle it. She came with you, or maybe you didn't bring the gun, maybe she did. O'Connell was trembling. He looked at the door, looking for an escape that didn't exist. I'm signing the confession, O'Connell said, grabbing the pen Belle had left on the table. He scribbled his name on the document, the signature jagged and frantic. There, it's done. Take me to booking. He thrust the paper at Belle. It's over. Belle looked at the signature. It was a legal admission of guilt. It was enough to close the case file, enough to satisfy the DA, enough to satisfy the press. He could walk out of this room a hero. But he looked at the tickets to Los Angeles. He looked at the boy who had been denied a life in the sun. Belle took the confession. He looked Daniel O'Connell in the eye, and then he ripped the paper in half. No, Belle said, dropping the pieces on the floor. It's not over. I don't want the Paperboy, Daniel. I want the person who pulled the trigger. Belle turned and walked to the door. Where are you going? O'Connell screamed, real terror in his voice now. Belle, come back here. I confessed. You have to arrest me. Belle paused at the threshold. I'm going to visit your mother, Senator, Belle said. I think it's time she and I had a talk about the winter of 82. He closed the heavy steel door, muffling the senator's screams, and walked toward the parking lot. The snow was still falling, burying the city, but for the first time in 42 years, the ice was beginning to crack. The drive to the west side was a journey through a tunnel of white. The snow had thickened, reducing Cleveland to a blur of headlights and hazard flashes. Detective Lucas Bell gripped the steering wheel of his unmarked sedan, his knuckles white, his mind replaying the physics of a 42-year-old murder. He had left the senator broken in the interrogation room, but he hadn't left the case behind. The silence in the car was heavy, filled with the ghosts of the O'Connell family. Bell knew he was gambling his career. He had walked away from a signed confession to chase a hunch about an 85-year-old woman living in a geriatric palace. If he was wrong, if Daniel O'Connell really was the shooter, Bell would be turning in his badge by morning. But the angle didn't lie. The geometry of death was absolute. Bell pulled his phone from the center console. He dialed the observation room back at the precinct. "This is Bell," he said when the sergeant answered. "Don't book him yet. Keep him in the room. I need to talk to him one more time, but not face to face. Put me on the speaker." "Detective, he's a mess," the sergeant whispered. "He's rocking back and forth. He keeps asking for the tickets. Just put me on." There was a click, a burst of static, And then the hollow, metallic sound of the interrogation room filled Bell's car. He could hear Daniel O'Connell's ragged breathing. "Daniel?" Bell said, his voice projecting from the speaker on the wall, a disembodied conscience. "I'm not in the room, I'm driving, I'm going to see Martha." On the other end of the line, the breathing hitched, a sound of pure animal panic. "No, Lucas, please. Don't go there, she's frail. She doesn't know." "She knows," Bell interrupted, steering the car onto the highway ramp. "She's known for 42 years. But I need you to tell me how it happened, Daniel. I know you didn't pull the trigger. I know you were too short. But you were there. You were the bait." "I can't," the senator sobbed. "I promised her. I swore on the Bible." "You swore to protect a mother who loved you," Bell said, his voice hard. "But a mother who loves you doesn't make you an accomplice to murder. She doesn't let you carry the weight of her sin for a lifetime. She doesn't let you believe that you killed the only person who tried to save you." Bell let the silence hang for a moment, watching the windshield wipers battle the slush. "Tell me about the shadow, Daniel. Tell me about the shadow in the snow." The line went quiet for so long, Bell thought the connection had dropped. But then a voice came through, small, terrified, and 12 years old. "It was so cold," Daniel whispered. "The wind was hurting my face." Bell didn't speak. He let the memory take hold. "She told me we had to go for a walk," Daniel continued, the words spilling out now, a dam breaking. "She put the gun in her coat pocket. She said Serafina was a bad woman. She said Serafina was trying to steal me away, like a witch in a storybook. She said we had to go stop her." In his mind, Bell could see it, the towering figure of Martha O'Connell, a woman of iron will and jealous possession, buttoning the coat of her shivering son. She didn't send him alone. She marched him out the door. "We walked through the blizzard," Daniel said. "My mom. She walked right behind me, close, so close I could feel her knees hitting the back of my legs. She used me as a shield against the wind, or maybe she was hiding behind me. The shadow in the snow." Bell turned off the highway. The nursing home, the golden horizon, was visible on the hill. A sprawling complex of warm lights and manicured grounds, a fortress of comfort for the wealthy and forgotten. "What happened on the porch, Daniel?" Bell asked. "She gave me the candy," Daniel said, his voice trembling. "A peppermint. She told me to put it in my mouth. She said when she opens the door, you smile. You offer her a candy. You make her look at you." Bell felt a wave of nausea. It was a hunting tactic. Use the innocent lure to distract the prey. "I knocked," Daniel whispered. "I didn't want to, but Mom had her hand on my shoulder. She was squeezing so hard it hurt. She whispered in my ear. She said, 'Do it for Mommy. Don't let her take you.'" Bell pulled into the parking lot of the nursing home. The snow crunching under his tires sounded like bones breaking. "Serafina opened the door," Daniel said. "She looked relieved. She smiled at me. She said, 'Danny, come inside, quick.' She reached out for me. She was going to hug me. She was going to take me to California." "And then?" Bell asked, killing the engine. "I tried to speak, I tried to warn her, but the peppermint was in my mouth and I was frozen. I just stood there." The senator's voice broke into a jagged sob. "My mother stepped out from behind me. I felt her arm go over my shoulder, right next to my ear. I smelled her perfume, lilac and gunpowder. She didn't say a word, She fired," Bell finished. "The noise was so loud," Daniel cried. "It made my ears ring. Serafina. She looked surprised. She didn't look scared, just surprised. She fell backward. The red started spreading on the snow. And my mother put the gun in my hand." Bell sat in the dark car, staring up at the lit windows of the nursing home. This was the twist that had buried the truth for 4 decades. The physical evidence pointed to Daniel because he was the one holding the weapon when the police never came. But the moral weight, the act of execution, belonged to the woman standing in his shadow. "She grabbed my face," Daniel whispered. "She made me look at Serafina. She said, 'You did this, Danny. You made this happen because you loved her too much. If you tell anyone, they'll take you to jail forever. You have to protect Mommy. Only bad boys make Mommy go away.'" Gaslighting. Pure, refined, high-grade psychological torture. Martha O'Connell hadn't just killed a woman. She had murdered her son's soul. She had rewritten his reality, convincing him that his affection was a lethal weapon, that his desire for escape was the cause of death. She had turned him into a prisoner of his own guilt, a perfect silent sentinel guarding her secret. "I believed her," Daniel said, his voice hollow. "For 42 years, I believed I pulled the trigger, even when I knew I didn't. I felt like I did." "You didn't do it, Daniel," Bell said firmly. "You were a hostage." "Is she there?" Daniel asked. "Are you at the home?" "I'm here." "She won't admit it," Daniel warned. "She never admits anything. She rewrites history until it fits her. She's not like other people, Lucas." "I know," Bell said. He opened the car door, the cold air hitting him. "But I have something she doesn't have anymore." "What?" "I have her son," Bell said, "and he just stopped protecting her." Bell hung up the phone. He walked toward the entrance of the Golden Horizon. The automatic doors slid open with a cheerful whoosh, welcoming him into a lobby that smelled of lavender, potpourri, and sanitizer. A receptionist looked up, smiling brightly. "Can I help you, sir? Visiting hours are technically over, but—" Bell flashed his badge. He didn't smile back. "I'm here to see Martha O'Connell," he said, "and I'm not a visitor." He moved past the desk, down the carpeted hallway, lined with watercolor paintings of sailboats and gardens. It was a soft, gentle world, designed to make the end of life comfortable. It was the last place you'd expect to find a cold-blooded killer. But Bell knew the truth now. He knew that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a mother protecting her nest. Sometimes it wears a wool coat and hides behind a child in a blizzard. He reached room 302. The door was ajar. Inside, he could hear the faint sound of a television playing a game show. Bell pushed the door open. Martha O'Connell sat in a high-backed armchair by the window, looking out at the falling snow. She was 85 years old, her hair a cloud of white gossamer, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked fragile, harmless. She turned her head as Bell entered. Her eyes were the same pale blue as her son's, but where Daniel's were filled with pain, hers were clear, sharp, and terrifyingly empty. There was no dementia in that gaze. There was only recognition. She didn't ask who he was. She didn't ask why he was there. She simply smiled, a small, tight curving of the lips that Bell recognized from the crime scene photos, the same way a trap smiles before it snaps shut. "You're late," Martha said, her voice thin but steady. "I expected you 40 years ago." Bell stepped into the room, the door clicking shut behind him, sealing them in. The shadow in the snow had finally been brought into the light. The room smelled of lavender potpourri and the faint metallic tang of oxygen from a nasal cannula that Martha O'Connell wasn't wearing. It draped over the bedside table like a discarded snake. The television was muted, casting a flickering blue light over a collection of porcelain figurines on the dresser. Shepherds, dancers, innocent things that gathered dust in the quiet stillness of the end of life. Detective Lucas Bell stood by the closed door, his presence feeling large and intrusive in the delicate ecosystem of the nursing home room. Martha O'Connell sat in her high-backed chair, her hands resting on the armrests, with the composure of a queen holding court. She didn't look 85. Her eyes, clear and sharp as cut glass, held a vitality that belied her frail frame. They were eyes that had watched a blizzard bury a body 42 years ago and hadn't blinked since. "You have his chin," Martha said, breaking the silence. Her voice was like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "My husband's. You have that same stubborn set to your jaw. Are you here to arrest an old woman, detective?" Bell walked further into the room, pulling the single visitor's chair to the center of the rug. He sat down, bringing himself to eye level with the woman who had cast the longest shadow in Cleveland. "I'm here to talk about the weather," Bell said quietly, "specifically the snowfall on December 18th, 1982. Martha smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who had won a game a long time ago and was amused that the opponent was just now realizing they had lost. A terrible night. So cold. Poor Serafina. A tragedy. Drop the act, Martha, Bell said, his voice hard. I just left your son. He's in a cell. He confessed to shooting her. For the first time, a flicker of genuine emotion crossed her face. It wasn't fear, it was satisfaction. A dark, possessive pride. Danny is a good boy. He always does what he's told. He protects his family. He's protecting a lie, Bell countered. I know he didn't shoot her. He was 4'10". The bullet entered at a downward angle. Unless Danny was standing on a ladder in the middle of a blizzard, he physically couldn't have pulled that trigger. But you were 5'8". In boots, maybe 5'9". Bell leaned forward, invading her space. You were standing right behind him, weren't you? You used your own son as a human shield. You marched him up those steps. You made him offer the candy, and then you reached over his shoulder and executed a woman. Martha didn't flinch. She reached for a glass of water on the table, her hand steady. She took a sip, watching Bell over the rim of the glass. You think you understand my family, detective. You think you know what happened in that house. You read the police reports. You saw the calls about Big Jim. She set the glass down with a precise clink. Everyone thought Jim was the monster, the big, loud union boss with the whiskey temper. It was so easy to let them believe that. Bell frowned. Serafina filed a report. She saw bruises on Daniel. Yes, Martha said softly. She did. She saw the bruises on his arms, on his neck. She assumed Jim did it. Everyone always assumed Jim did it. She leaned back, her eyes gleaming. Jim never touched the boy, Martha whispered. He yelled. He drank. But he never raised a hand to Danny. He was too soft. He wanted to coddle him. I was the one who had to teach him discipline. I was the one who had to make him strong. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The narrative Bell had constructed, the violent father, the helpless mother, disintegrated. Big Jim O'Connell was a brute, yes, but he wasn't the abuser. Martha was. She was the architect of the pain. Serafina saw the bruises, Bell said, the horror dawning on him, and she knew. She knew it was you. That woman, Martha spat the word like a curse, was a thief. She didn't just teach him piano, she was stealing him. Danny started coming home late. He started talking back. He started looking at me differently. He looked at me with judgment. She was turning my own son against me. She was poisoning him with her music and her cookies and her soft, weak love. She was trying to save him, Bell said. She bought tickets to California. She was going to take him away from you. I know, Martha said calmly. I found the brochure in his pocket. I saw the way he looked at her, like she was the sun and I was just the dark. I couldn't allow that. A mother doesn't let her child be stolen. Bell felt sick. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was a crime of possession. Martha O'Connell viewed her son not as a person, but as property. So you killed her, Bell said. You walked him over there in the snow and you killed her in front of him. I stopped her, Martha corrected. I put an end to the interference. We walked up the steps. Danny was shaking. He didn't want to knock. I had to pinch the back of his neck to make him do it. When she opened the door, she didn't even look at me. She looked right at him. She had that suitcase in the hall. She was ready to take him that very night. Martha's eyes drifted to the window, watching the snow fall in 2024, remembering 1982. I had the gun in my pocket, Jim's gun. I reached around Danny. He was so small then, just a little thing. I put the barrel right next to his ear. I wanted him to hear it. I wanted him to understand the permanence of it. You fired, Bell whispered. You fired, Bell whispered. One shot. She fell backward. She looked so surprised. It was quiet then, just the wind. And then you gave him the gun, Bell said. You put the murder weapon in the hands of a 12-year-old boy. Martha smiled again, and it was the most terrifying thing Bell had ever seen. I had to, detective. Don't you see? If I had just killed her and we went home, he would have been afraid of me. He might have told. He might have run away. I had to bind him to me. I had to make him complicit. She mimed the motion, her arthritic hand gripping an invisible revolver. I put it in his hand. It was heavy for him. I grabbed his face. I looked him in the eye. I told him, "You did this, Danny. This is your fault. Because you loved her too much, you made Mommy do this. If the police come, they'll take Mommy to the electric chair. Do you want Mommy to burn? Do you want to be an orphan?" Bell closed his eyes. He could hear the voice of the 12-year-old boy in the interrogation room. "I killed her because she was leaving." Daniel O'Connell hadn't been protecting a murderer. He had been brainwashed into believing he was the murderer. Martha had planted a seed of guilt in a traumatized child's mind and watered it with fear for 42 years. She had groomed him to be her keeper, her protector, her prisoner. "You destroyed him," Bell said, opening his eyes. "You didn't just kill Serafina. You killed your son that night. The man sitting in that cell isn't a senator. He's a ghost you created." "He's a success," Martha snapped, her voice rising. "Look at him. He's a senator. He's powerful. He's respected. I made him focus. I took away the distractions. I took away the weakness. I made him a great man." "You made him a hollow man," Bell said, standing up. "He spent every day of his life waiting to be punished for a crime he didn't commit. He confessed, Martha. He tried to take the fall for you again today." "Of course he did," she said, smoothing her skirt. "He's a good boy. He loves his mother." Bell looked at the frail old woman and saw the monster underneath. There would be no remorse here. There would be no tearful confession of regret. She was a sociopath who had successfully weaponized maternal instinct. "The tickets," Bell said. "Did you know about the tickets?" "I knew she was planning to take him. I didn't care about the details." "She bought two," Bell said. "One for her, one for a child. She wasn't stealing him, Martha. She was saving him. And you knew it. You didn't kill her because she was a bad influence. You killed her because she saw you. She saw exactly what you were." Bell walked to the door. He had what he needed. He had the truth. But as he reached for the handle, Martha spoke one last time. "You can't prove it," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It's an old woman's word against a dead woman's ghost. Danny will never testify against me. He can't. I own him. I own his memories. I own his soul." Bell paused. He looked back at her. "You owned him," Bell corrected. "Past tense." He pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen was glowing. The recording app was running, the waveform moving in time with the silence in the room. "Ohio is a one-party consent state." "You're right, Martha," Bell said, tapping the stop button. "He might not testify, but he doesn't have to. You just did it for him." Martha's eyes widened, the first crack in her armor appearing as she realized that technology had done what 42 years of guilt couldn't. Bell opened the door. "I'm going to play this for him," Bell said. "I'm going to let him hear you say it. I'm going to let him hear you laugh about it. And when he hears that, when he realizes that his entire life was built on a lie you fed him—" Bell stepped into the hallway, the sounds of the nursing home rushing back in, a cart rattling, a nurse laughing, a bell dinging. "I think the spell is going to break," Bell said, "and you're going to die in this room alone." He walked away, leaving the door open, leaving her exposed to the hallway light. An old woman shrinking in her chair as the fortress she had built around her son finally began to crumble. The cold case was solved. But the thawing of Daniel O'Connell was the real victory. Bell headed for the exit. He had a recording to play. He had a boy to save. The interrogation room had not changed, but the man inside it had aged a lifetime in the hour Detective Bell had been gone. Senator Daniel O'Connell sat with his head in his hands, staring at the torn pieces of his confession on the floor. He looked like a man waiting for the executioner to tighten the hood. When the heavy steel door clicked open, O'Connell didn't look up. He simply flinched, as if expecting a blow. Detective Bell didn't sit down. He walked to the table and placed his phone in the center, the black screen reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights. It looked like a monolith in the silence. "I went to see her, Daniel," Bell said. His voice was soft, devoid of the aggression he had used earlier. It was the voice of a man who had seen something broken and was trying to figure out if it could be glued back together. O'Connell looked up. His eyes were red, swollen, and terrified. "What did she say?" "She told me the truth," Bell replied. "Not the version she fed you for 42 years. The real version." "She's sick," O'Connell whispered, the defense automatic ingrained. "She's confused. You can't trust—" "She wasn't confused," Bell cut him off. "She was clearer than she's been in decades. And now you need to listen. You need to really listen, Daniel, not as a son protecting his mother, but as the boy who stood on that porch." Bell pressed play. The audio quality was crisp. The background noise of the nursing home hummed, and then Martha O'Connell's voice cut through the air like a razor wire. "You think you understand my family? Detective, that woman was a thief. She didn't just teach him piano, she was stealing him." Daniel went rigid. He stopped breathing. He stared at the phone as if it were a venomous snake coiled on the table. The recording continued. Bell watched the senator's face as Martha described the gun, the cold, and the way she stood behind him. He watched as Daniel heard his mother admit in her own cold, proud voice that she had pulled the trigger. "I had to, Detective. I put it in his hand. I told him, 'You did this, Danny. This is your fault.'" A sound escaped Daniel O'Connell, a sharp intake of breath that sounded like a drowning man breaking the surface. He clamped his hands over his ears, shaking his head violently. "Stop it! Turn it off, please!" "No," Bell said, his hand hovering over the phone to prevent Daniel from grabbing it. "You need to hear the end. Danny will never testify against me. He can't. I own him. I own his memories. I own his soul." Bell hit stop. The silence that rushed back into the room was deafening. For a long minute, nothing happened. Daniel sat frozen, the echo of his mother's ownership hanging in the air. I own his soul. It was the mantra that had defined his existence. It was the chain that had bound him to a crime he didn't commit. And then the chain snapped. Daniel O'Connell let out a scream. It wasn't a scream of fear. It was a scream of primal, agonizing release. He swept the file off the table. He kicked the chair back. He collapsed onto his knees, burying his face in his hands, sobbing with a force that shook his entire body. It was 42 years of grief, 42 years of guilt, 42 years of hating himself for a murder he hadn't committed, all pouring out at once. Bell knelt beside him. He didn't touch him. He just let him break. "You didn't kill her, Daniel," Bell said firmly. "You never killed her. You were a 12-year-old boy who was used as a weapon by a jealous woman. Serafina didn't die because you loved her. She died because she was trying to save you, and your mother couldn't stand to lose her possession." "She saved me," Daniel choked out, looking up at Bell through a veil of tears. "Serafina, she really was saving me." Bell reached into his pocket and pulled out the TWA airline tickets. He placed them on the floor in front of the kneeling senator. "She died fighting for you," Bell said, "and she wouldn't want you to spend one more second in this prison your mother built for you." The legal fallout was swift and unprecedented. By 8 a.m. the next morning, the district attorney had listened to the tape. By 9 a.m., the charges against Senator Daniel O'Connell were dropped with prejudice. The confession he had signed was shredded. Martha O'Connell was never arrested. At 85, with a diagnosis of dementia on her chart, despite the clarity of her confession, the state deemed her unfit to stand trial. She remained in the Golden Horizon nursing home, but the senator stopped paying the bills. The state took over her care. She died 4 months later, alone in a room overlooking the parking lot, still believing she had won. But she hadn't. Daniel O'Connell resigned from the Senate 2 days after his release. He held a press conference, not to salvage his career, but to clear a name. Not his own. Hers. "For 42 years, Daniel told the cameras, his voice steady for the first time in his life, this city believed Serafina March was a random victim. She wasn't. She was a hero. She saw a child in pain when everyone else looked away. She died trying to give that child a future. I am that child. And I am alive today because she loved me enough to try. The scandal destroyed his political career, but it gave him back his life. A week later, on a grey Tuesday that smelled of thawing snow, Lucas Bell found Daniel O'Connell at the Lakeview Cemetery. He was standing in front of a modest headstone that read, Serafina March, 1952-1982. The snow had been cleared away from the grave. Lying on the fresh earth was a bouquet of white lilies and a single unopened peppermint candy. "Detective," Daniel said without turning around. He looked different. The weight was gone from his shoulders. He looked younger despite the grey hair. "Mr. O'Connell," Bell nodded. "I just came to pay my respects." "She hated the snow," Daniel said softly. "She told me once that in California the sun shines even in December. She wanted me to see that." "You still can," Bell said. Daniel smiled. It was a genuine smile, sad but free. "I bought a ticket this morning, one way, to Los Angeles." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the old carbon copy TWA ticket Bell had given him from the evidence locker. He placed it on the headstone, tucking it under the flowers so the wind wouldn't take it. "I'm finally using it," Daniel whispered to the stone. "I'm a little late, Sarah, but I'm going." Bell watched him walk away. The former senator, the former suspect, the former prisoner of his own mind, walking toward the gate with his head up. He wasn't running away from the past anymore. He was walking toward the life Serafina March had bought for him with her last breath. Bell looked down at the grave. The wind picked up, rustling the trees, but the silence of the cemetery felt different today. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't accusing. It was peaceful. The cold case was closed. The ice had melted. Some stories are about catching the bad guy, but the best stories are about freeing the good guy. We spend so much time looking for monsters under the bed that we forget to look for the saviors standing right in front of us. Serafina March played her music, fought her battle, and died in the snow so a boy could have a chance. It took 42 years, a peppermint wrapper, and a detective who understood the geometry of a lie. But the music finally reached the coda. If this story moved you, if you believe that the truth is the only thing that can thaw a frozen heart, please subscribe and share this video. Help us keep the names of the heroes alive long after the snow has melted. Because justice doesn't just punish the guilty, it frees the innocent from the prisons they built inside their own minds. And sometimes freedom is just a plane ticket away.